I'm tired of hearing people talk about how God is good. God is loving. He seems cruel to me.
I thought you didn't believe in God at all.
Well, I don't. It's better to believe in no God than to believe in the monster described in the Bible.
Is non-belief really the right way to respond to something that is unpalatable to you?
I suppose not. The reason I don't believe in God is lack of evidence. Nonetheless, I'd find it easier to believe in a God who really was good and loving. But if God is like he is described in the Bible, I refuse to worship him. If he wants to punish me or withhold rewards, then let him.
That's a bold statement. It sounds like you have a strong sense of right and wrong, and that you would put your principles above your self-interest.
Yes, of course. You should not assume that just because I'm an atheist, I don't have ethical principles and a sense of human dignity.
Where did you get these principles? I mean, where could your sense of right and wrong come from other than God?
Science is on the verge of explaining it. It must be an instinct developed over billions of years of evolution. Altruism is a survival mechanism for the species.
Sounds far-fetched. I mean, I can see nature giving a parent an instinct towards self-sacrifice for the sake of a child, or even for a community. But a man being willing to anger a force of unlimited power, for the sake of some notion of dignity? That seems alien to the animal part of our nature.
What can I say? It's how I feel. It would be wrong to worship an evil God, even if he did exist, which he doesn't.
Does that feel like an instinct to you? Like hunger or fear or exhaustion or attraction?
No, I suppose not. It's a different kind of sentiment altogether, high-minded and dignified. Perhaps I cannot explain it. Perhaps nature is not everything there is. But what about you? Are you saying you will follow a cruel God just because he is powerful?
No, I'm not saying that.
But would you deny that the God of the Bible is cruel?
I would certainly deny that Jesus Christ is cruel.
Sure, Jesus sounds like a good guy who taught some good things and lived a good life. Although he sounds too judgmental for my taste. Judgmental people really annoy me.
If you read the Gospels carefully, you'll find that Jesus taught people not to be judgmental towards others, but to be humble and focus on doing the right things themselves. And to the extent Jesus himself said some judgmental things, he was speaking as God, so that comes with the territory. Just like how loving parents generally teach their children to imitate them, but not in things where their roles are different. An older sibling might be taught by parents not to reprimand a younger one even though the parents do so themselves.
Well, fine. But my main problem isn't with Jesus. It's that Old Testament God, who's always showing anger and taking vengeance, and causing floods and plagues, and making up ridiculous rules of behavior.
Always is quite an exaggeration. There is a lot of mercy and patience and wisdom in many of the Old Testament books. God is shown to be slow to anger, but sometimes seeing fit to chastise those whom he loves.
But there are several parts that are totally over the top. In Deuteronomy, God teaches that a rebellious son should be stoned to death. In the book of Joshua, God orders the Israelites to make war on their neighbors and show no mercy. This sounds like Momoke Dafi to me. And in 1 Samuel, God orders genocide against the Amalekites, even the babies. Seriously, can you defend any of that?
No, I can't.
Then why do you believe it?
I suppose I don't believe those stories. I believe in a God of love. This is the God that is revealed in Jesus Christ and preached by the apostles in the New Testament. I believe this because I recognize God in Jesus, in a way that I don't recognize him in some of the troublesome Old Testament passages. I also believe this because the New Testament's origins, for various reasons we've talked about in other videos, look a lot more historical than those of the Old Testament.
But aren't you just picking and choosing what you want to believe, instead of following the whole Bible?
I try not to do that. I know God's ways are higher than mine, and His thoughts are higher than mine, so I'm willing to accept there are some things I can't understand about Him that nonetheless are good. Some of the teachings of Jesus are hard to understand, some are hard to accept, but because I recognize His voice I will do my best to follow Him all the way. And because Jesus valued the Old Testament scriptures, I value them too. But He did not teach that all scriptures were absolutely free from error. We discussed this at length in another video. On divorce, for example, He said that what Moses taught was not really God's way. And He refused to condemn someone to death by stoning under the Mosaic law. And He made a point of criticizing a religious establishment that was focused on compliance with silly man-made rules of behavior, at the expense of love and justice. It seems clear to me that Jesus would not support genocide.
So why is the genocide story, to take just one example, in the Bible to begin with?
I suppose the author of Samuel was making a more general point about commitment and obedience. Genocide was the context, and sadly it might have not shocked ancient heirs as much as it does ours, because it was more common in those days. Don't assume that everything should be taken at face value. Consider another example that might be on your mind, Psalm 109, which is often criticized for its vindictive language. It might not be meant as a model for prayer, but as a picture of someone in great emotional pain. As C.S. Lewis put it, perhaps the caption underneath it should read, "This is what becomes of a man when you mistreat him."
But surely a perfect God could have dictated a perfect book that would have made sense to all people at all times.
I don't think God dictated the Bible. Men wrote the Bible, and in it we see not a direct revelation but an indirect one. The Bible, to borrow another phrase from Lewis, is something like a picture gradually coming into focus. The story reaches its fulfillment in Jesus, but it's notable that He Himself did not write any book of His own. This is consistent with how He taught, which was that discipleship is passed on person to person, by example. The villains of the Gospel stories, the Pharisees, are said to be searching for God in the Scriptures, but refusing to come into His living presence.
So why is the Bible held up by so many, especially Protestants, as being such an all-important thing?
All Christians treasure the Bible, but yes, some Protestants go so far as to almost make an idol out of it. I suspect it's an overreaction of sorts. We all know that the medieval Catholic Church went off embracing all kinds of corrupt man-made teachings and traditions, losing touch with the original message of Christ. Protestants see the Bible as a check against that kind of abuse, and anchor back to the time of the apostles, and rightly so. But there is a danger of making the Bible more important than the Spirit, and to overemphasize the writings of men at the expense of the living God. Jesus taught in parables, which were both memorable and packed with meaning. His message was meant to be passed on by word of mouth and by example. For almost 18 centuries, it was nonsense to think that the average Christian would have a complete copy of the Bible in their home and use it to scrutinize every word of the Old Testament and put these on par with the words of Christ Himself.
So basically you're saying I don't have to fear God. He's not a monster but basically a nice guy.
I see God as a loving parent, not a monster, but not Santa Claus either. God cares for you and cares for me, but He asks a lot of us as well. Not for His own sake, but because it is essential in some ways for our growth and His overall plan. Like children, we may not understand the big picture. It is healthy for us to have some fear of Him, as we would fear a parent, fear in the sense of being filled with awe and wonder, and in knowing that the consequences of turning away from His ways would be terrible. But greater than the fear should be our assurance of His love. As St. Paul put it, nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God.